In the vast expanse of the Galactic Coalition's most prestigious academy, where the brightest minds from 1,000 worlds gathered to prove their worth, there was one test that had never been failed. Not once in 3 centuries. The examination was simple in its premise, terrifying in its implications. Identify the greatest threat in the room. Every species had their champions. The Zephyrians with their crystalline intellects that could process 1,000,000 variables per second. The Canthri with their ability to see through dimensional rifts and perceive hidden dangers. The Vorthak whose evolutionary paranoia made them living threat detection systems. All had sat for this exam. All had passed with flying colors, correctly identifying the sophisticated holographic scenarios, the hidden weapons, the disguised assassins, and the temporal anomalies that served as red herrings. But today was different. Today, for the first time in the Academy's history, every single candidate failed the exam. Every genius, every prodigy, every carefully selected representative of their respective civilizations looked at the same room and came to the same wrong conclusion. Every candidate except one. She sat quietly in row 3, her unremarkable appearance drawing no attention from the proctors or her fellow test-takers. While others deployed advanced scanning equipment, activated psychic abilities, and consulted databases containing the profiles of every known threat in the galaxy, she simply observed. When the results were announced, and species after species heard their champions had failed, she remained calm. Because she alone understood what they had all missed. Sometimes the greatest threat isn't what you can see, measure, or categorize. Sometimes it's what everyone believes is harmless. Sometimes it's what hides in plain sight, overlooked precisely because it appears so ordinary. Sometimes the greatest threat is the one thing in the room that no one considers dangerous at all. The girl from Earth. The Academy of Infinite Minds floated in the void between galaxies, a massive structure that defied conventional physics and challenged the imagination of even the most advanced civilizations. Built from materials that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, it served as the premier educational institution for the Galactic Coalition's most promising young minds. Getting accepted here wasn't just an honor, it was practically impossible. Sarah Chun had never intended to be here. 3 months ago, she'd been a graduate student at MIT, working on her dissertation about pattern recognition in chaotic systems. Her research focused on finding order in seemingly random data, a pursuit that most considered academic masturbation, but that she found endlessly fascinating. The work was obscure, underfunded, and largely ignored by her peers who were busy chasing more glamorous fields like quantum computing or bioengineering. Then, the ships arrived. Not the dramatic invasion that humanity had imagined in countless movies and books, but a quiet announcement that Earth had been observed, evaluated, and found marginally interesting enough to warrant contact. The Galactic Coalition had been watching human development for several centuries. They explained through their translation matrices, waiting to see if humanity would destroy itself or evolve beyond its primitive aggressive tendencies. The jury was still out on that second part. Sarah remembered the day the Coalition representative, a being that looked like a walking prism made of condensed starlight, had appeared in her university laboratory. It had spoken to her in perfect English, though its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah Chun, it had said, somehow making her ordinary name sound exotic. Your work on pattern recognition has been reviewed by our Educational Assessment Committee. You have been selected to represent your species at the Academy of Infinite Minds. She'd laughed. Actually laughed out loud. I think you have the wrong person. I'm not even the smartest human in this building, let alone qualified to represent my entire species. Intelligence quotient is not the primary selection criterion, the being had replied, its crystalline form shifting colors in what she later learned was amusement. We seek minds that perceive differently. Your pattern recognition research suggests a cognitive approach that may prove interesting. That was 3 months ago. Now she sat in Examination Hall Omega, surrounded by the most brilliant beings the galaxy had to offer, all preparing to take the test that would determine their placement in the Coalition's most advanced training programs. The hall itself was a marvel of engineering. Circular in design, it could accommodate nearly 1,000 different physiological requirements simultaneously. Environmental zones shifted seamlessly from a methane-heavy atmosphere preferred by the Deltans to the high-pressure helium mix that the Rigelians needed to think properly. Gravity varied across the floor in precise gradients. Temperature fluctuated in controlled patterns, and even time itself moved differently in various sections to accommodate species whose thought processes operated on different temporal scales. Sarah found herself in what the Academy called the baseline zone, designed for carbon-based life forms with standard atmospheric requirements. She shared this section with about 30 other beings, including several that looked almost human if you didn't look too closely. The similarities were unsettling: 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, but the differences became apparent in the details. Silver skin that seemed to shift and flow, eyes that held too many colors, proportions that were just slightly wrong in ways that made her primitive brain whisper warnings about the uncanny valley. To her left sat Zix, 47, a canthery whose species had evolved from hive-minded insects before developing individual consciousness. Zix's compound eyes could perceive electromagnetic radiation across 17 different spectrums simultaneously, and the translation device at their throat converted the clicking, chittering sounds of their native language into crisp English. They'd been polite enough during the orientation sessions, though Sarah got the impression that they found human social customs quaint and primitive. To her right was Thymonvel, a Zephyrian whose crystalline body housed a quantum processing matrix that could perform calculations at speeds that made Earth's most advanced computers look like pocket calculators. Thymon communicated through harmonic resonances that bypassed language entirely, transmitting complex mathematical concepts directly into the listener's mind. Conversations with them left Sarah with mild headaches and a disturbing sense that her own thoughts were embarrassingly slow and linear. Behind her, a being whose name translated roughly as the one who swims between light streams, occasionally emitted pulses of bioluminescence that served as both communication and a way of measuring temporal distortions in local space-time. Their species existed partially outside normal reality, which gave them unique insights into multidimensional threats, but made them nearly impossible to hold a normal conversation with. These were her competitors. These were the minds she was supposed to match wits against. Each one represented the absolute pinnacle of their species' intellectual achievement, carefully selected through competitions that spanned entire star systems. Some had been training for this opportunity since birth. Others had been genetically or cybernetically enhanced specifically for this moment. And then there was Sarah, who'd gotten a B- in calculus and whose greatest academic achievement was a research paper that 12 people had read. The examination proctor entered through a dimensional portal that opened with a sound like reality tearing. Professor Kethveric was a Vorthack, a species whose evolutionary history included being hunted by nearly every predator on their hellish homeworld. This constant threat had shaped them into living paranoia engines, beings whose every instinct was tuned to detect danger, assess threats, and survive encounters that would kill most other life forms. Kethveric stood nearly 3 meters tall, with skin that looked like polished obsidian and eyes that moved independently of each other, constantly scanning for threats that others might miss. Their hands ended in claws that could cut through most known materials, and their reflexes operated on a timescale that made bullets seem slow. "Welcome, candidates," Kethveric said, their voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "You are here to take the Threat Assessment Examination, a test that has been administered at this academy for 317 standard years. In that time, it has been failed exactly 0 times." A murmur ran through the assembled candidates. Sarah could hear Thymon's crystalline form humming with increased harmonic activity, while Zix's compound eyes dilated as they shifted through different visual spectrums. "The examination is simple in concept," the professor continued. "You will observe this chamber for exactly 1 standard hour. During that time, You must identify the single greatest threat present in this room. You may use any abilities, equipment, or analytical methods at your disposal. At the end of the hour, you will submit your analysis. There's only one correct answer. The professor's eyes swept across the room, lingering briefly on each candidate. When their gaze met Sarah's, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the environmental controls. Some of you are wondering why this test has never been failed, Kethveric said. It is because the threat has always been obvious to minds trained in proper analytical techniques. Today's examination chamber contains 17 different potential threats, ranging from Class C temporal anomalies to Class A dimensional incursions. 15 of these are sophisticated deceptions designed to mislead you. One is a genuine threat capable of ending your existence. One is the true answer to the question. They paused, allowing the implications to sink in. The examination begins now. Immediately, the room erupted into activity. Candidates deployed scanning equipment that materialized from pocket dimensions, activated psychic abilities that made the air shimmer with mental energy, and began consultations with AI systems whose processing power exceeded most planetary networks. Zix, 47 spread their arms wide, compound eyes blazing as they scanned across electromagnetic spectrums that human science had barely theorized about. Lines of force became visible around them as they mapped energy flows throughout the chamber. Diamonvel's crystalline body began resonating at frequencies that made nearby candidates step back. Complex mathematical equations appeared in the air around them, holographic representations of calculations being performed at quantum speeds. The one who swims between light streams phased partially out of normal reality, their bioluminescent patches pulsing in patterns that corresponded to their movement through higher dimensions. They were literally looking at the room from angles that existed outside conventional space. Other candidates activated equally impressive abilities. Sarah watched a Deltan candidate release clouds of nanoscale sensors that dispersed throughout the room like intelligent fog. A Rigelian began communing with what appeared to be the chamber's computer systems, their consciousness interfacing directly with the Academy's quantum networks. Someone behind her started manipulating localized time flows, aging small objects to test for temporal instabilities. And Sarah sat quietly and watched, not because she was frozen with fear or overwhelmed by the sophistication of her competitors' methods. She watched because watching was what she did best. Pattern recognition wasn't just her field of study. It was how her mind naturally worked. While others deployed advanced technology and exotic abilities to gather more data, she processed what was already visible. The chamber was circular, about 50 meters in diameter, with walls that seemed to be made of the same dimensionally complex materials as the rest of the Academy. The ceiling displayed what appeared to be a real-time view of the space outside. Galaxies wheeling slowly in the cosmic void, distant stars forming elaborate constellations that changed too slowly for normal observation, but which a trained eye could detect. 17 threats, the professor had said. 15 deceptions, and one real threat. One correct answer. Sarah began cataloging what she could observe without equipment. There was a section of wall near the chamber's eastern edge where the dimensional complexity seemed slightly off, probably a concealed doorway or possibly a weak point where something could breach through from another reality. The environmental controls were operating normally in most sections, but there was a small area where the atmospheric composition was fluctuating in ways that suggested either a malfunction or a deliberately concealed threat. Near the chamber's center, space itself seemed to bend in a way that was almost imperceptible but definitely wrong. A gravity well? Maybe, or some kind of spatial distortion that could be hiding a cloaked object. The lighting in the northwest quadrant had a subtle flicker that occurred exactly every 3.7 seconds, too regular to be random, which meant it was either a countdown to something or a signal of some kind. As the examination progressed, she began to see the bigger picture. Each of the obvious anomalies was indeed sophisticated, requiring advanced detection methods to fully analyze. No wonder every previous candidate had focused on these clear, measurable threats. They were designed to attract attention from minds trained to look for complex, hidden dangers. But Sarah's background was different. She wasn't trained in threat assessment or military strategy. Her expertise was in finding patterns in chaos, in recognizing when something didn't fit the expected model. And as she observed her fellow candidates working feverishly to analyze the 17 planted threats, a different pattern began to emerge. They were all looking in the wrong direction. The greatest threat in the room wasn't any of the sophisticated deceptions that had been placed there for them to find. It wasn't the temporal anomaly or the dimensional weak point or the gravity distortion. It wasn't any of the things that required advanced technology or exotic abilities to detect. The greatest threat was something much more fundamental, something that none of the other candidates would think to consider dangerous, because their entire worldview was based on the assumption that it couldn't be. Sarah looked around the room one more time, confirming her analysis. Zix, 47, was deep in concentration, their compound eyes blazing as they mapped energy patterns that probably revealed sophisticated holographic projections. Thymon Vel had generated a small mathematical storm around themselves, quantum calculations examining every molecule in the chamber for signs of hidden danger. Behind her, the one who swam between light streams had gone almost completely translucent, existing mostly in dimensions that allowed them to perceive threats that operated outside normal reality. Other candidates were deploying abilities that bent the laws of physics, accessing databases that contained the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 civilizations, and applying analytical methods that represented the pinnacle of galactic science. And they were all going to fail, because none of them understood what Sarah was slowly beginning to realize. This wasn't just a test of threat detection. It was a test of perspective. It was a challenge to see beyond the assumptions built into their training, their culture, and their species-specific blind spots. The greatest threat in the room was the one thing that every advanced civilization in the galaxy had learned not to fear, the one element that everyone had been taught was harmless precisely because it appeared so ordinary, so primitive, so obviously non-threatening. The human, Sarah Chun, sitting quietly in row 3, was the greatest threat present in the examination chamber. Not because she was armed or dangerous or possessed of hidden powers, but because she represented something that the Galactic Coalition didn't understand and couldn't predict, a mind that worked differently, that saw patterns others missed, that could find solutions in ways that didn't fit any known model. They'd invited her here, thinking she was just another primitive intelligence, interesting perhaps, but ultimately manageable. They designed their test assuming that all minds, regardless of species, would approach the problem using the same basic logic: identify the hidden threat, analyze its capabilities, assess its danger level. But human minds didn't always work that way. Sometimes they asked different questions entirely. As the examination period entered its final minutes, Sarah made her decision. She activated her personal recording device, a simple voice recorder that looked primitive compared to the quantum computers and telepathic interfaces being used by other candidates, and spoke quietly into it. Threat assessment. The greatest threat present in this chamber is the candidate designated Sarah Chun, human female, positioned in row 3, seat 17. Reasoning. All other threats in the chamber are known quantities, either sophisticated deceptions or measurable phenomena that can be detected and countered using established coalition technologies and protocols. The human candidate represents an unknown variable whose cognitive patterns and behavioral predictions fall outside all existing models. Her species has no established diplomatic relations with the coalition, no technological treaties, and no cultural frameworks that guarantee peaceful intentions. Unlike other candidates who have been selected through established criteria and training programs, the human selection appears to have been based on intuitive factors rather than measurable qualifications. This makes her presence the only truly unpredictable element in the chamber, and therefore the greatest threat to controlled conditions and expected outcomes. She paused the recording and sat back, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake. Around her, other candidates were finalizing their analyses of spatial distortions and energy anomalies, confident in their sophisticated detection methods and advanced analytical techniques. In a few minutes, Professor Kethverick would collect their responses and grade them against the single correct answer. 17 potential threats had been placed in the chamber. 15 were deceptions. 1 was a real but manageable danger, and 1 was the true answer to the question. Sarah was betting everything on the possibility that she'd understood something her competitors had missed. She was wagering her entire future on the idea that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room wasn't the thing everyone was trained to fear. Sometimes it was the thing no one thought to worry about at all. The examination period ended with a soft chime that seemed to come from the chamber walls themselves. Around her, candidates began deactivating their equipment and submitting their analyses. The air filled with the electromagnetic signatures of data transfers as responses were uploaded to the Academy's evaluation systems. Sarah submitted her simple audio recording, noting how primitive it looked compared to the multidimensional data structures and quantum encrypted files being transmitted by other candidates. She'd either made the most brilliant insight in the test's 300-year history, or she'd just embarrassed herself and her entire species in front of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Professor Kethverick collected the final submissions and stood at the chamber's center, their obsidian skin reflecting the otherworldly lighting and patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Results will be processed and announced within 1 standard hour, they said. Candidates are dismissed to await notification. As the chamber began to empty, Sarah remained seated. She wasn't sure if she could stand without her legs shaking, and she definitely wasn't ready to face the inevitable questions from her fellow candidates about her analysis method. Instead, she watched them file out, noting how their body language reflected confidence in their sophisticated approaches. Only when the chamber was nearly empty did she finally rise and make her way toward the exit. As she reached the dimensional portal, Professor Kethverick's voice stopped her. "Miss Chun." She turned, meeting those independently moving eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "Yes, Professor." "Tell me," Kethverick said, their voice carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. "What made you think to look at the problem from that particular angle?" Sarah considered the question, realizing that the professor already knew her answer. They'd been monitoring the examination process, which meant they'd reviewed her submission. "Pattern recognition," she said simply. "I study chaos theory and nonlinear systems. When you put a complex problem in front of most minds, they start by looking for the most complex solution. But sometimes the answer is simple. Sometimes the thing that doesn't fit the pattern is the thing everyone's ignoring because it seems too obvious or too ordinary to matter." Professor Kethverick's skin color shifted in what she was learning to recognize as Vorthack expressions of deep thought. "And you believed yourself to be that anomaly?" "I knew I was," Sarah said. "The question was whether that made me the answer to your question." For a moment that stretched longer than it should have in normal space-time, they regarded each other. Then, Professor Kethverick's skin shifted to a pattern that might have been approval or amusement or something far more complex. "The results will be announced in 57 minutes, they said. "I suggest you prepare yourself for some interesting conversations." Sarah left the examination chamber with a distinct impression that her life was about to become much more complicated than she'd ever imagined possible. The Academy's central evaluation chamber existed in a space that was technically nowhere and everywhere at once. Professor Kethverick materialized there through a dimensional fold, carrying the examination data in a crystalline storage matrix that contained more information than most civilizations produced in a standard year. They were not alone. The chamber held the Academy's most senior faculty, beings whose collective knowledge spanned millions of years, and whose decisions shaped the development of entire galactic sectors. Director Velnari, an ancient eternal whose species had transcended physical form eons ago, manifested as a shifting aurora of pure thought energy. Master Quantum Singer Yith maintained 17 simultaneous consciousness states to analyze problems from multiple temporal perspectives. The collective mind of Terminus Station, representing the amalgamated intelligence of a billion linked cybernetic entities, processed data streams that moved faster than light itself. These were minds that had designed the Academy's testing protocols over centuries of careful refinement. They had created examination systems that perfectly evaluated cognitive ability across thousands of different species, cultural backgrounds, and evolutionary paths. Their tests were flawless, their methodology unassailable, their track record absolutely spotless, which made what was about to happen unprecedented in ways that would reshape their understanding of intelligence itself. Evaluation protocols initiated, announced the Academy's primary AI, a consciousness so vast that it existed partially in 11 dimensions and maintained separate thinking processes for each major galactic civilization. Beginning analysis of Threat Assessment Examination. Session 47,291. Total candidates 943, representing 217 distinct species and cultural variants. Kethveric interfaced their crystalline storage device with the evaluation system, uploading the examination data along with their own observational notes. They had administered this test over 800 times in the past century, and they knew exactly what to expect. The analysis would reveal sophisticated threat detection, advanced pattern recognition, and the kind of multidimensional thinking that marked truly exceptional minds. Initiating candidate response analysis, the AI continued, processing submissions in order of complexity and analytical sophistication. The first submissions appeared as holographic displays throughout the chamber, showing the detailed analyses provided by the examination's most promising candidates. Zix-47's response was a masterwork of electromagnetic analysis, correctly identifying 14 of the planted deceptions and providing detailed breakdowns of their operational mechanisms. They had detected the temporal anomaly in Sector 7, mapped the gravitational distortion in the chamber's center, and even identified the dimensional weak point that was invisible to most scanning methods. Candidate Zix-47, the AI announced. Analysis quality, exceptional. Threat detection accuracy, 93%. Identified genuine threat. Class C temporal destabilization field, Sector 7. Overall grade, fail. Master Quantum Singer Yitha's consciousness rippled with confusion, their 17 thought streams converging on a single point of bewilderment. Fail? How is that possible? Their analysis was virtually perfect. The AI continued through the next submission. Daimon Vel had deployed quantum calculations that mapped every molecule in the chamber, identifying energy patterns that most beings couldn't even perceive. Their mathematical analysis had correctly categorized 15 of the 17 planted threats and provided probability assessments for various attack scenarios. Candidate Daimon Vel, analysis quality, exceptional. Threat detection accuracy, 95%. Identified genuine threat. Class B dimensional incursion point, Sector 12. Overall grade, fail. Director Velnari's auroriform pulsed with increasing intensity. In their transcendent existence, spanning geological ages, they had never encountered a scenario where advanced analytical methods failed so comprehensively. The pattern continued through submission after submission. The one who swims between light streams had examined the chamber from dimensions outside normal space-time, identifying threats that existed in parallel realities. A Deltan candidate had deployed nanoscale sensors that analyzed atmospheric composition down to individual molecules. A Rigelian had interfaced directly with the Academy's quantum networks, accessing databases containing threat profiles from across the galaxy. Every single response demonstrated exceptional analytical ability. Every candidate had correctly identified multiple planted threats using sophisticated methods that represented the pinnacle of their species' capabilities. Every analysis was logical, thorough, and methodologically sound, and every single one was marked as a failure. "This is impossible," declared the collective mind of Terminus Station, their billion-linked consciousnesses experiencing something that might have been panic if cybernetic entities were capable of such emotions. Our evaluation criteria are based on 3 centuries of proven methodology. These analyses demonstrate exactly the kind of advanced threat detection we seek to identify and develop. Keth Varick watched the evaluations continue, their paranoid instincts sensing something fundamentally wrong with the situation. They had designed this examination specifically to test the kind of sophisticated thinking that their civilization required. The planted threats were calibrated to challenge advanced minds while remaining detectable through proper analytical methods. The test had worked perfectly for over 300 years. So why were all the most qualified candidates failing? The AI reached the final submission in its analysis queue, and Keth Varick felt their skin shift to patterns of deep unease. This was the response that had troubled them most during the examination. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it was so completely different from everything else. Processing final submission, the AI announced. Candidate designation: Sarah Chun, human female. Analysis method: observational pattern recognition with minimal technological assistance. The holographic display showed something that looked absurdly primitive compared to the quantum calculations and multidimensional analyses they had just reviewed. A simple audio recording, lasting less than 3 minutes, containing a straightforward explanation in basic language. Playing submission audio, the AI said. Sarah's voice filled the chamber, clear and unadorned with the technological enhancements used by other species. She spoke in plain English, her words translated automatically into the various languages and communication methods used by the faculty present. Threat assessment. The greatest threat present in this chamber is the candidate designated Sarah Chun, human female, positioned in row 3, seat 17. Director Velnari's aurora form flickered with something that might have been surprise. Master quantum singer Yitha's 17 consciousness streams suddenly, converged into a single, focused point of attention. Sarah's recorded voice continued. Reasoning: all other threats in the chamber are known quantities, either sophisticated deceptions or measurable phenomena that can be detected and countered using established coalition technologies and protocols. The human candidate represents an unknown variable whose cognitive patterns and behavioral predictions fall outside all existing models. The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of dimensional stabilizers. No one spoke as Sarah's simple analysis played to its conclusion, but Keth Varick could sense the growing tension among the faculty members. This wasn't just different from the other submissions. It was operating from an entirely different framework of understanding. Her species has no established diplomatic relations with the coalition, Sarah's voice continued. No technological treaties, and no cultural frameworks that guarantee peaceful intentions. Unlike other candidates who have been selected through established criteria and training programs, the human selection appears to have been based on intuitive factors rather than measurable qualifications. This makes her presence the only truly unpredictable element in the chamber, and therefore the greatest threat to controlled conditions and expected outcomes. The recording ended. The evaluation chamber remained silent for several moments that stretched across multiple time zones due to the various temporal perception rates of those present. Finally, the AI spoke. Analysis complete. Candidate Sarah Chun. Analysis method: novel. Threat identification: accurate. The single greatest threat present in Examination Chamber Omega was indeed the unpredictable cognitive patterns of the human candidate herself. Another pause. Then, in a tone that somehow conveyed mechanical bewilderment, overall grade: pass. Perfect score. First successful completion of Threat Assessment Examination, Session 47,291. The implications hit the faculty like a cascade failure in a quantum processor. Not only had a single candidate passed while hundreds failed, but she had done so by identifying herself as the threat. She had solved the puzzle not through advanced technology or sophisticated analysis, but by recognizing that the puzzle itself was based on incorrect assumptions. How is this possible? Master quantum singer Yith demanded. There's 17 consciousness streams now completely chaotic with confusion. The examination is designed to test threat detection capabilities using established analytical frameworks. The planted threats were calibrated according to 3 centuries of proven methodology. Director Velnari's transcendent form pulsed with what might have been agitation. Run a complete diagnostic on the evaluation system. There must be an error in the grading algorithms. But Keth Varric was beginning to understand what had happened, and their understanding filled them with the kind of deep unease that their species experienced when encountering a predator they couldn't classify or counter. There is no error, they said slowly. The human found the correct answer because she wasn't limited by our analytical frameworks. They paused, their obsidian skin shifting through patterns that reflected accelerating thought processes. We designed this test assuming that all candidates would approach the problem using sophisticated detection methods. We planted 17 threats specifically to challenge advanced analytical capabilities. But we never considered the possibility that the greatest threat might be something that couldn't be detected through technology or measured through standard protocols. The collective mind of Terminus Station processed this information through a billion-linked consciousness, their cybernetic logic struggling to accommodate concepts that didn't fit established parameters. Are you suggesting that our entire testing methodology is flawed? I'm suggesting, Keth Varric replied, that our testing methodology is optimized for minds that think like ours. We've spent centuries refining examinations that perfectly evaluate candidates whose cognitive patterns follow predictable models. But what happens when you encounter a mind that doesn't follow any known model? They activated a holographic display showing the examination chamber from multiple angles. Look at the data from a different perspective. Every candidate with advanced analytical training focused on the planted threats because those threats were designed to attract the attention of advanced minds. They were sophisticated enough to require complex detection methods, which made them irresistible to beings trained in threat analysis. The display zoomed in on Sarah's position during the examination. But the human didn't fall into that trap. She observed the entire situation, including elements that weren't part of the test scenario itself. While others deployed technology to find hidden dangers, she recognized that the most unpredictable element in the room was her own presence. Director Velnari's aurora form stabilized into something resembling deep consideration. You're suggesting she solved the examination by thinking outside the parameters we established. I'm suggesting she solved it by recognizing that the parameters themselves were part of the problem, Keth Varric corrected. Every other candidate assumed that the greatest threat would be detectable through advanced methods. The human understood that sometimes the greatest threat is the thing everyone assumes is harmless. Master quantum singer Yitha's consciousness streams began to synchronize as they processed this concept. If this analysis is correct, then our examination protocols may be fundamentally inadequate for evaluating truly novel cognitive approaches. The implications were staggering. The Academy of Infinite Minds prided itself on identifying and developing the most advanced intellectual capabilities in the galaxy. Their testing methods had been refined over centuries to evaluate every known form of intelligence, from quantum processing crystalline minds to multidimensional consciousness entities. The examinations were perfect at identifying excellence within established frameworks. But what if excellence could exist outside those frameworks entirely? We need to review the entire evaluation, Director Velnari declared. If the human candidate identified a fundamental flaw in our testing methodology, we need to understand how extensive that flaw might be. The AI began processing the examination data from new perspectives, applying analytical frameworks that didn't assume standard threat detection protocols. As the analysis progressed, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Every candidate had assumed that the greatest threat would be something requiring advanced detection methods. This assumption was so fundamental to their thinking that they had never questioned it, even though the examination instructions had been remarkably simple. Identify the greatest threat in the room. Not the most sophisticated threat. Not the most technologically advanced threat. Not the threat that required the most complex analysis to detect. Simply the greatest threat. And when viewed from that perspective, Sarah's answer was not only correct, but obvious. A being whose cognitive patterns fell outside all known models, whose cultural background provided no frameworks for prediction, whose species had no established relationship with galactic civilization. Such a being represented a massive, unknown variable in any controlled environment. The human's analysis is logically flawless, the AI announced after completing its review. Her identification of herself as the greatest threat present is accurate according to standard threat assessment protocols. All other candidates failed because they were solving a different problem than the one presented. The evaluation chamber filled with the various expressions of shock, confusion, and deep thought as the faculty members processed this information. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a complete paradigm failure in their most fundamental testing methodology. But more than that, they had discovered something potentially revolutionary. If human cognitive patterns could identify flaws in analytical systems that had seemed perfect, what other blind spots might exist in their understanding? What other assumptions had they built into their civilization that needed to be questioned? What do we do with this information? Asked the collective mind of Terminus Station. How do we integrate a mind that operates outside our predictive models? Keth Varick's skin shifted to patterns of grim determination. We learned from it, and we hope that our decision to bring her here doesn't prove to be the kind of threat she claimed it was. The Academy had been designed to identify and develop the most advanced minds in the galaxy. But for the first time in its history, they had encountered a mind that might be more advanced than their ability to understand or predict it. And that mind belonged to a human who had solved their unsolvable test by pointing out that she herself was the answer they were looking for. In the vast complexity of galactic civilization, where every threat could be measured, categorized, and countered through advanced technology and sophisticated analysis, the human had identified the one threat that couldn't be quantified, the unknown. The question now was whether they could learn to work with that unknown, or whether Sarah Chin's presence at the Academy would prove to be exactly the kind of unpredictable threat she had claimed it was. The notification came to Sarah while she sat in the Academy's meditation garden, a space designed to accommodate the contemplative needs of hundreds of different species. Crystalline trees that existed in 17 dimensions provided shade that offered both physical comfort and temporal stability. Streams of liquid light flowed between islands of solid music, while the air itself had been programmed to carry microscopic harmonics that promoted neurological calm across diverse brain structures. It was, Sarah reflected, probably the most peaceful place she'd ever experienced, which made the sudden appearance of a dimensional portal in front of her particularly jarring. Professor Keth Varick emerged from the portal with movements that suggested controlled urgency. Their obsidian skin was cycling through rapid pattern changes, something she'd learned indicated either excitement or extreme stress in their species. "Miss Chun," they said without preamble, "the examination results have been processed." Sarah set down the Academy handbook she'd been reading, noting how Keth Varick's independently moving eyes were tracking potential threats throughout the garden even during this conversation. "Let me guess. I failed spectacularly and embarrassed my entire species." "Quite the opposite," Keth Varick replied, their skin shifting to a pattern she didn't recognize. "You achieved the first perfect score in the examination's 300-year history. You are also the only candidate to pass." The words took several seconds to penetrate. Sarah stared at the professor, trying to process information that seemed fundamentally impossible. "I'm sorry, what?" "The only one to pass. Out of 943 candidates. 942 failures," Keth Varick confirmed. "One perfect score. The Academy's entire evaluation methodology has been called into question as a result." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Called into question how? Instead of answering directly, Kethveric gestured toward the portal. "The Academy Council has requested an immediate audience with you. I should warn you that this is unprecedented. The Council rarely involves itself directly in student affairs." The portal transported them to a chamber that existed in a space Sarah's mind couldn't quite process. The walls seemed to be made of crystallized time, showing glimpses of past and future events and patterns that shifted faster than conscious thought could follow. The floor was solid darkness that somehow provided perfect footing, while the ceiling displayed what looked like the fundamental mathematical structures that governed reality itself. Around a table that was simultaneously circular and multidimensional sat beings that represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. Director Velnari manifested as an aurora of pure thought that spoke directly into Sarah's consciousness. Master Quantum Singer Yith maintained their 17 simultaneous existence states, each one observing the meeting from a different temporal perspective. The collective mind of Terminus Station appeared as a shifting geometric form that contained the linked awareness of a billion cybernetic consciousnesses. These were beings whose decisions shaped the development of entire galactic sectors, whose knowledge spanned millions of years, whose understanding of reality operated on levels that most minds couldn't even conceive. And they were all staring at Sarah with expressions that ranged from fascination to barely controlled alarm. "Sarah Chun of Earth." Director Velnari's voice resonated directly in her mind, carrying harmonics of ancient wisdom and power that made her feel like a child being addressed by forces beyond comprehension. "Your performance on the threat assessment examination has raised questions that require immediate resolution." Sarah found her voice, though it sounded small in the vast conceptual space of the chamber. "What kind of questions?" Master Quantum Singer Yith's 17 consciousness streams converged into a focused response. Questions about the fundamental validity of our evaluation methodologies. Questions about cognitive paradigms that may exist outside our analytical frameworks. Questions about whether we understand intelligence as completely as we believed. The collective mind of Terminus Station processed this statement through their billion-linked consciousnesses before responding in a voice that carried the weight of accumulated cybernetic wisdom. "Your solution to the examination was not just correct. It revealed flaws in our testing protocols that we had never considered possible." Sarah felt increasingly out of her depth. "I don't understand. I just answered the question as honestly as I could." "That," said Kethveric from behind her, "is precisely the problem. Every other candidate approached the examination using sophisticated analytical methods designed to detect complex threats. You approached it using simple observation and logical reasoning. The fact that your simple approach succeeded while their sophisticated methods failed suggests that our understanding of optimal cognitive function may be incomplete." Director Velnari's aurora form pulsed with colors that Sarah somehow understood represented deep concern. "We have built our civilization on the principle that advanced analytical capabilities represent the highest form of intelligence. Our technology, our educational systems, our entire social structure assumes that more sophisticated thinking is always superior to simpler approaches. But your examination performance suggests that this assumption may be flawed," added Master Quantum Singer Yith. "You identified the correct answer not through advanced analysis, but through a cognitive approach that we don't fully understand and can't reliably predict." Sarah was beginning to understand why they were concerned. "You're worried that I represent some kind of unknown variable that could disrupt your systems. We're concerned," corrected the collective mind of Terminus Station, "that your cognitive patterns may represent a form of intelligence that operates outside the frameworks we use to understand and predict behavior. This creates unprecedented challenges for educational planning, social integration, and risk assessment." The chamber fell silent for several moments while the council members processed information at speeds that operated beyond normal temporal limitations. Sarah found herself studying the walls, watching glimpses of past and future events flicker through the crystallized time. She caught sight of vast battles between species she didn't recognize, the birth and death of stars, mathematical discoveries that reshaped entire civilizations. It was overwhelming and beautiful and utterly beyond her comprehension, which, she realized, was exactly the point. "You're all incredibly advanced," she said finally. "Your technology can manipulate time and space. Your minds can process information at quantum speeds. Your civilizations span thousands of years and entire galactic sectors. But you've become so sophisticated that you can't see simple solutions anymore." Director Velnari's form flickered with what might have been surprise. "Explain." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt inadequate for the situation. "On Earth, we have a principle called Occam's razor. When you're faced with multiple explanations for something, the simplest one that accounts for all the data is usually correct. Your examination was designed to test sophisticated threat detection, so you created sophisticated threats that would challenge advanced analytical methods." She paused, noting how the council members were listening with an intensity that suggested her words carried implications she didn't fully understand. But the question wasn't identify the most sophisticated threat or demonstrate advanced analytical capabilities. It was just identify the greatest threat in the room. And sometimes the greatest threat is the simplest one, the unknown variable that everyone's ignoring because it doesn't fit the expected pattern. Master quantum singer Yitha's 17 consciousness streams began fluctuating in patterns that suggested rapid calculation. "You're suggesting that our advancement has created blind spots in our perception." "I'm suggesting that when you get really good at looking for complex problems, you sometimes miss simple ones," Sarah replied. "Like when you're so focused on scanning for sophisticated cyber attacks that you miss the guy walking out the front door with a USB drive full of your data." The collective mind of Terminus Station processed this analogy through their billion-linked consciousnesses. An interesting parallel. But this raises a more fundamental concern. If human cognitive patterns can identify flaws in our analytical systems, what other blind spots might exist in our civilization that we haven't recognized? Sarah felt a chill of understanding. "That's why you're really worried, isn't it? Not just about me, but about what I might represent. If one human with pattern recognition training can spot problems in your most fundamental testing methodology, what happens when more humans start looking at other aspects of your civilization?" Director Velnari's aurora form expanded slightly, colors shifting to patterns that radiated ancient concern. "Humanity represents the first truly unknown cognitive variable we've encountered in over 1,000 years. Every other species we've integrated into galactic civilization has followed predictable developmental patterns. Their intelligence enhances in measurable ways that we can model and accommodate. But human cognition appears to operate from fundamentally different assumptions," added Keth Varick. "You don't just think differently, you think about thinking differently. This makes your future development impossible to predict using any models we possess." Sarah was beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation she'd stumbled into. "You brought me here thinking I was just another primitive intelligence that you could evaluate and catalog. But now you're realizing that I might represent something you can't control or predict." "Precisely," confirmed Master Quantum Singer Yith. "And this creates a paradox that we're struggling to resolve. Your cognitive patterns clearly have value. You solve the problem that 942 advanced minds could not. But we don't understand how you solved it, which means we can't replicate your methods or predict when they might be useful. More concerning," added the collective mind of Terminus Station, "we can't predict when your different cognitive approach might identify problems in other aspects of our civilization that we've never considered." The implications were staggering. Sarah was beginning to realize that her presence at the Academy wasn't just about her education. It was about the potential impact of human cognition on galactic civilization itself. She represented a wild card in systems that had been optimized for predictability and control. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do you send me home? Lock me up somewhere safe? Study me like a lab specimen?" Director Velnari's form shifted through a complex sequence of colors before stabilizing into what Sarah somehow understood was resolution. We offer you a choice, Sarah Chin of Earth. You can return to your home world with our gratitude and a complete memory erasure of these events. You would resume your previous life with no knowledge of galactic civilization, and we would designate Earth as a protected system to be left undisturbed for the foreseeable future. What's the alternative? You remain at the Academy and help us understand the implications of your cognitive approach, replied Master Quantum Singer Yith. You would become not just a student, but a research subject helping us identify and address blind spots in our understanding that we never knew existed. But, added the collective mind of Terminus Station, you should understand that this choice would fundamentally alter not just your life, but potentially the development of galactic civilization itself. Your presence here as a cognitive unknown represents exactly the kind of unpredictable threat you identified in the examination. Sarah stared at the council members, trying to process the magnitude of what they were offering. Return to Earth and live a normal life, or stay and potentially reshape the understanding of an entire galactic civilization. It was the kind of choice that shouldn't exist outside of science fiction stories. But then she thought about the examination, about how hundreds of incredibly advanced minds had failed to see a simple solution because they were looking in the wrong direction. She thought about how their sophisticated analytical methods had missed something that pattern recognition training could identify. She thought about how often in human history the most important discoveries had come from minds that saw problems differently, that asked different questions, that refused to accept that the current way of doing things was the only way. If I stay, she said slowly, what guarantee do I have that you won't decide I'm too dangerous and lock me up somewhere? None. Director Velnari admitted with brutal honesty. You represent an unknown variable in systems designed for predictability. If your presence begins to destabilize critical aspects of our civilization, we may be forced to take containment measures. But, added Kethverik, you also represent the first significant advancement in our understanding of intelligence that we've encountered in millennia. The potential benefits of learning from your cognitive approach may outweigh the risks. Sarah considered this, realizing that she was being offered the chance to be part of something unprecedented. Not just first contact between humanity and galactic civilization, but the first encounter between galactic civilization and a truly unknown form of intelligence. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course, replied Master Quantum Singer Yith. But understand that while you deliberate, your presence here continues to represent the very threat you identified. Every moment you spend at the Academy is a moment of unpredictable variables affecting systems designed for control and stability. Sarah nodded, understanding the irony. She'd solved the examination by identifying herself as the greatest threat in the room. Now she had to decide whether she was willing to continue being that threat, or whether she would choose the safety of returning to a life where she would never know what impact or different way of thinking might have had on the galaxy. As she prepared to leave the council chamber, Director Velnari's voice resonated once more in her mind. Sarah Chin of Earth, regardless of your decision, you have already changed us. Your examination performance has forced us to question assumptions we've held for thousands of years. That change cannot be undone, no matter what choice you make. The portal back to the meditation garden opened behind her, offering a temporary escape from the overwhelming complexity of the decision she faced. But Sarah understood that there was no real escape. Whether she stayed or left, she had already become the unpredictable element that could reshape everything. The only question was whether she would choose to embrace that role, or spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been if she'd been brave enough to find out just how different the galaxy could look when viewed through human eyes. Sarah's decision came 3 days later, during what the Academy called a temporal reflection period, time set aside in a pocket dimension where thoughts could develop without external interference. She'd spent those 3 days walking through impossible landscapes, sitting beside streams of liquid starlight, and gradually coming to understand that the choice itself was an illusion. She could return to Earth and pretend this never happened, but the knowledge would eat away at her. She'd spend the rest of her life wondering what discoveries might have been made, what problems might have been solved, what breakthroughs and understanding could have emerged if she'd been brave enough to see it through. The memory erasure might take away the specific details, but it couldn't remove the fundamental change in how she viewed the universe and humanity's place in it. More importantly, Director Velnari had been right. The change was already irreversible. Her examination performance had forced the Academy to question their most basic assumptions about intelligence and threat assessment. That questioning would continue whether she stayed or left, but if she left, it would happen without any human perspective to guide it. She'd realized, in those 3 days of reflection, that leaving would be the ultimate example of the human cognitive patterns that had troubled the Council so much, making a choice based on incomplete information and emotional comfort rather than logical analysis of potential outcomes. So she made the choice that felt simultaneously inevitable and terrifying. She stayed. The Academy's response to her decision was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, she found herself assigned to a special research track that existed nowhere in the Academy's official curriculum. Her new quarters were in a section of the station that operated on flexible physics, allowing the environment to adapt to whatever experimental conditions might be required. Her class schedule consisted of a single entry: Cognitive Integration Studies, Variable Parameters. Professor Kethveric became her primary liaison, though Sarah quickly realized that the paranoid Vorthak was serving as much as a monitor as an educator. Their role was to observe and document how human cognitive patterns interacted with Academy systems, to identify potential points of conflict or instability, and to develop protocols for managing what everyone politely called cognitive diversity. The first sign that her presence was having wider implications came during her second week in the program. Sarah was attending a lecture on multidimensional physics when Professor Yilthak, a renowned Rigelian quantum theorist, presented what they described as an impossible problem in spatial mathematics. For 16 centuries, Professor Yilthak explained to the mixed class of advanced students, "We have known that certain quantum field equations cannot be resolved using conventional mathematical approaches. The variables exist in states that are mathematically contradictory, creating paradoxes that have resisted solution despite the efforts of our most advanced analytical minds." The professor projected a holographic representation of the equations, mathematical structures so complex that they seemed to bend space around themselves. Sarah stared at the display, watching the numbers and symbols shift through configurations that hurt to think about directly. These equations govern the interaction between consciousness and quantum fields in regions of extreme space-time curvature. Professor Yilthak continued. Understanding them would allow us to predict how psychic phenomena behave near black holes, how thought-based technologies function in the cores of stars, and why certain forms of telepathic communication become impossible in regions of high gravitational stress. Around the classroom, students from dozens of species worked furiously with quantum processors, crystalline analytical matrices, and other technologies that Sarah couldn't begin to understand. They attacked the problem with sophisticated approaches that represented millions of years of mathematical development across multiple civilizations. Sarah looked at the equations and immediately saw something that none of them had noticed. "Professor," she said, raising her hand hesitantly, "I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be." The classroom fell silent. Professor Yilthak's specialized eyes evolved to perceive quantum fluctuations directly, focused on her with surprise. "Miss Chun, these equations represent one of the most fundamental unsolved problems in advanced physics. I assure you that the complexity is inherent to the subject matter." "But you're treating consciousness as a variable," Sarah replied, standing up to get a better view of the holographic display. "What if it's a constant?" Professor Yilthak's skin color shifted through several shades that indicated confusion. "I don't understand your meaning. Consciousness varies dramatically between individuals, species, and developmental stages. It cannot be considered mathematically constant." "Not the content of consciousness," Sarah clarified, walking toward the holographic equations. "The fact of consciousness." the underlying structure that allows awareness to exist at all. She pointed to a section of the equations where variables were canceling each other out in loops that seemed to have no resolution. Look, you try to account for how different types of consciousness interact with quantum fields. But what if the important factor isn't the type of consciousness, but the relationship between any consciousness and the quantum substrate that allows it to exist? The classroom remained silent as Sarah traced patterns in the holographic mathematics with her finger. On Earth, we have a principle in physics, the observer effect. The act of observation changes the system being observed. What if consciousness doesn't interact with quantum fields in different ways based on its complexity, but in consistent ways based on the fundamental fact that it exists? She paused, suddenly, aware that dozens of incredibly advanced minds were staring at her with expressions ranging from fascination to disbelief. I mean, if consciousness is what collapses quantum probability waves into defined states, then maybe the type of consciousness doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is just that consciousness is present to do the collapsing. Professor Yilthak stared at the equations for several long moments, their specialized perception analyzing quantum interactions faster than normal minds could follow. Slowly, their skin began shifting to colors that Sarah didn't recognize. If we treat consciousness as a constant rather than a variable, they said slowly, the contradictory elements resolve into. They activated their quantum processor, running calculations that filled the air around the holographic display with streams of mathematical analysis. The impossible equations began to change, variables rearranging themselves into configurations that suddenly made sense. This is elegant, Professor Yilthak whispered, their voice filled with something that might have been awe. 16 centuries of unsolved physics, and the solution was to stop making it complicated. Around the classroom, students began activating their own analytical systems, confirming the professor's calculations. The equations that had resisted solution for over a millennium were resolving into simple, beautiful mathematics that revealed new understanding about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Sarah sat back down, noting how her classmates were looking at her with expressions that contained equal parts admiration and unease. She'd done it again, solved a complex problem by recognizing that the complexity itself was the problem. After class, Professor Yilthak approached her with movements that suggested barely controlled excitement. Miss Chun, your insight into the consciousness equations represents a breakthrough that will reshape our understanding of psychic phenomena throughout the galaxy. How did you know to approach the problem from that angle? Sarah considered the question, trying to explain a thought process that felt natural to her, but apparently revolutionary to everyone else. I guess I just wondered why you were making it so complicated. On Earth, we have a saying, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. Professor Yilthak's skin cycled through rapid color changes as they processed this concept. You consistently approach complex problems by questioning their fundamental assumptions rather than applying more sophisticated analysis to the existing framework. Is that bad? It's unprecedented, Professor Yilthak replied, and it's beginning to cause significant disruptions throughout the academy. Sarah felt that familiar cold sensation in her stomach. What kind of disruptions? Instead of answering directly, Professor Yilthak activated a communication device that projected a holographic display showing academy-wide statistics. Examination failures have increased by 300% since your arrival. Students across multiple disciplines are beginning to question methodologies that have been standard for centuries. Faculty members are reporting unprecedented challenges to established analytical frameworks. The display showed data streams that painted a picture of institutional destabilization. Students who had been performing at optimal levels were suddenly struggling with examinations that they should have found routine. Research projects that had been progressing smoothly were being abandoned as students and faculty began questioning their basic assumptions. Your approach to problem-solving appears to be contagious, Professor Yilthak continued. Students who observe your methods begin applying similar questioning strategies to their own work. This is creating cascade effects throughout the Academy's educational systems. Sarah stared at the data, realizing that her presence was having exactly the kind of destabilizing effect that the Council had feared. Should I stop? Maybe I could work independently, avoid influencing other students. That would not address the fundamental issue, Professor Yilthak replied. The problem is not your direct influence on individual students. The problem is that your success in solving problems through simplified approaches is forcing the Academy to confront the possibility that our entire educational philosophy may be flawed. The implications were staggering. The Academy of Infinite Minds wasn't just an educational institution. It was the primary source of intellectual leadership for galactic civilization. Students trained here went on to become the researchers, administrators, and decision-makers who shaped the development of entire star systems. If the Academy's methods were flawed, then those flaws would propagate throughout the galaxy over generations. What happens now? Sarah asked. Professor Yilthak's color patterns shifted to configurations that suggested grim determination. Now we discover whether the Academy can adapt to accommodate cognitive diversity or whether the disruptions will force more drastic measures. That evening, Sarah received a priority communication from Professor Kethveric requesting her immediate presence in the Academy Strategic Planning Center. The facility existed in a space that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, allowing its occupants to observe and analyze events throughout the galactic sector in real time. When she arrived, she found Kethveric along with representatives from several other Academy departments: Advanced Threat Analysis, Civilizational Stability Assessment, and Long-Range Predictive Modeling. Their expressions suggested that whatever they needed to discuss was serious enough to require immediate attention. Miss Chun, Kethveric began without preamble, we've been monitoring the cascade effects of your presence at the Academy. The situation is developing faster than our most pessimistic predictions anticipated. They activated a holographic display that showed data streams from across the galactic sector. Academic institutions throughout Coalition space are reporting similar disruptions. News of your examination performance has spread through scholarly networks, inspiring students and faculty at other facilities to begin questioning their own methodologies. Sarah watched data points representing educational institutions across hundreds of star systems, noting how failure rates and methodology challenges were spreading in patterns that resembled viral infections. It's not just the Academy anymore. No, confirmed the representative from Civilizational Stability Assessment, a being whose species had evolved specifically to identify threats to social order. We're observing the beginnings of what could become a galaxy-wide academic crisis. Established educational systems are experiencing unprecedented challenges as students and faculty begin questioning assumptions that have been fundamental to their operations for millennia. The representative from long-range predictive modeling activated additional data streams that projected possible futures based on current trends. If these patterns continue, we could see the collapse of academic authority throughout Coalition space within 50 standard years. The social and technological stagnation that would result could set galactic civilization back by centuries. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. You're saying that my way of thinking is dangerous to your entire civilization. We're saying, Kethveric corrected, that your way of thinking represents a force of change that our civilization isn't equipped to handle gradually. The choice we face is adaptation or crisis. The representative from Advanced Threat Analysis, whose paranoid instincts rivaled even Kethveric's, leaned forward with obvious concern. The question we must resolve immediately is whether this represents an opportunity for beneficial evolution or a threat that requires active containment. Sarah understood what they weren't saying directly. They were deciding whether to study her as a valuable resource or lock her up as a dangerous influence. The cognitive patterns that had solved their unsolvable examination were now threatening to unravel the educational systems that held their civilization together. What would adaptation look like, she asked. Integration of simplified analytical approaches into existing curricula, replied the representative from long-range predictive modeling. Development of new testing methodologies that account for cognitive diversity. Fundamental revision of educational philosophies that have guided galactic academia for thousands of years. And containment? Keth Varick's skin shifted to patterns that suggested regret. Isolation of human cognitive influences to prevent further cascade effects. Limitation of your educational access to prevent additional disruptions. Possible development of countermeasures to neutralize the spread of questioning methodologies throughout existing academic networks. The choice was being presented as clinical analysis, but Sarah understood the personal stakes involved. Adaptation meant she could continue her education while helping galactic civilization develop new approaches to learning and problem-solving. Containment meant imprisonment, whether physical or intellectual. But more than her personal freedom was at stake. The cascade of questioning that had begun with her examination performance represented something unprecedented in galactic history. The possibility that established ways of thinking weren't optimal, that simpler approaches might sometimes be more effective than sophisticated ones, that intelligence itself might be more diverse and unpredictable than anyone had imagined. How long do I have to prove that adaptation is possible? She asked. The Academy Council is meeting tomorrow to make a preliminary decision, Keth Varick replied. If you can demonstrate that human cognitive approaches can be integrated into existing systems without causing catastrophic disruption, they may authorize continued experimentation. If not, they didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood that she had less than 24 hours to prove that her way of thinking was a benefit rather than a threat to galactic civilization. The problem was, she wasn't entirely sure they were wrong to be concerned. Her presence at the Academy had indeed caused massive disruptions to educational systems that had worked successfully for centuries. Students were failing examinations because they were questioning assumptions that had previously been unquestionable. Faculty members were struggling with challenges to methodologies that had been refined over millennia. Maybe her cognitive patterns really were too dangerous to be integrated into galactic civilization. Maybe the threat she'd identified in the examination room was even greater than she'd realized. But as she prepared to leave the Strategic Planning Center, Sarah remembered something that made her pause. The disruptions weren't random. They were concentrated in areas where students and faculty were encountering problems that couldn't be solved using traditional approaches. Her influence wasn't causing people to abandon functional methods. It was inspiring them to question methods that weren't working. Maybe the crisis wasn't that her way of thinking was dangerous. Maybe the crisis was that galactic civilization had become so invested in sophisticated solutions that they'd forgotten how to recognize when simple approaches might be more effective. She had 24 hours to prove that point, and the future of human galactic relations depended on whether she could demonstrate that cognitive diversity was a strength rather than a threat. The Academy had brought her here to test her intelligence. Now she was about to find out whether intelligence was defined by the ability to solve complex problems or by the wisdom to know which problems actually needed to be complex in the first place. Sarah spent the night before the Academy Council meeting in the Archive of Infinite Knowledge, a repository that contained the accumulated learning of galactic civilization spanning over 1 million years. The facility existed in a space where time moved differently, allowing researchers to spend subjective weeks analyzing information while only hours passed in normal reality. She wasn't there to research a specific topic. Instead, she was looking for patterns in the accumulated knowledge itself, trying to understand how galactic civilization approached learning, problem-solving, and intellectual development. If she was going to convince the Council that human cognitive patterns could be integrated safely, she needed to understand exactly what she was proposing to change. The data was overwhelming. Millions of species, billions of research projects, countless innovations that had shaped the development of technology, philosophy, and social organization across thousands of star systems. The scope of accumulated knowledge made human civilization look like a single paragraph in an infinite library. But as Sarah explored the archives, she began to notice something troubling. The rate of fundamental breakthroughs, discoveries that changed basic understanding rather than simply extending existing knowledge, had been declining steadily for the past several thousand years. Galactic civilization had become incredibly good at refining what they already knew. They could build computers that operated faster than light, manipulate matter at the quantum level, and create technologies that seemed magical to human understanding. But they hadn't had a genuinely revolutionary idea in centuries. The pattern was clear once she knew what to look for. As analytical methods became more sophisticated, thinking became more constrained. As educational systems became more refined, they became better at producing minds that worked within established frameworks, and worse at producing minds that could see beyond those frameworks entirely. The Academy of Infinite Minds was the culmination of this trend, an institution that perfectly identified and developed intellectual excellence as defined by existing paradigms, but that had lost the ability to recognize intelligence that operated outside those paradigms. Sarah realized that her examination performance hadn't just revealed a flaw in their testing methodology. It had revealed the end result of millions of years of intellectual optimization, a civilization that had become too sophisticated for its own good. As dawn approached in the Academy's artificial day cycle, she made her way to the council chamber with a growing understanding of what she needed to demonstrate. The question wasn't whether human cognitive patterns could be integrated into galactic educational systems. The question was whether galactic civilization could survive without them. The council chamber was fuller than it had been during her previous visit. In addition to the primary council members, representatives from major educational institutions throughout the galactic sector had gathered to observe the proceedings. Sarah recognized delegations from the Rigelian Academy of Sciences, the Crystalline Institutes of Zephyr Prime, and the collective learning networks of Terminus Station. These were beings whose decisions would shape the intellectual development of entire civilizations. If they decided that human cognitive patterns were too dangerous to integrate, Earth would likely be classified as a protected but quarantined system, forever cut off from galactic civilization to prevent further contamination. Director Velnari's aurora form pulsed with colors that suggested formal authority. Sarah Chun of Earth, the Academy Council has gathered to evaluate the impact of your cognitive patterns on educational stability throughout the galactic sector. We must determine whether integration is possible or whether containment measures are necessary. Master Quantum Singer Yith manifested in their full 17 consciousness configuration, each aspect observing the proceedings from a different temporal perspective. The cascade effects of your presence have exceeded our most pessimistic projections. Educational institutions across coalition space are reporting unprecedented challenges to established methodologies. The collective mind of Terminus Station processed data streams from across the galaxy in real time, their billion-linked consciousnesses analyzing patterns of disruption with cybernetic precision. Academic failure rates have increased by an average of 400% in institutions where your problem-solving approaches have been observed or discussed. This represents a crisis of educational confidence that threatens the stability of knowledge transfer systems throughout our civilization. Sarah listened to the litany of disruptions her presence had caused, noting how the data was presented as evidence of systematic failure rather than systematic questioning. They were treating the collapse of established methodologies as inherently negative, without considering the possibility that some of those methodologies might have deserved to collapse. "If I may," she said when the presentation concluded, "I'd like to offer a different interpretation of the data you've presented." Director Velnari's aurora form flickered with surprise. "You believe the educational disruptions are beneficial?" "I believe they're necessary," Sarah replied, activating a holographic display that showed her analysis from the archive of infinite knowledge. "Your civilization has been experiencing a decline in fundamental breakthroughs for thousands of years. The rate of revolutionary discoveries, insights that change basic understanding rather than simply extending existing knowledge, has approached zero. She highlighted specific data points that showed the pattern clearly. You've become so good at sophisticated analysis that you've lost the ability to see simple solutions. Your educational systems produce minds that can work brilliantly within established frameworks, but that can't recognize when those frameworks themselves might be the problem. Master quantum singer Yitha's 17 consciousness streams converged on a single point of analysis. You're suggesting that our intellectual advancement has created cognitive limitations. I'm suggesting that optimization for one type of thinking necessarily creates blind spots for other types of thinking, Sarah clarified. When you select for minds that excel at complex analysis, you select against minds that might see simple solutions. When you reward sophisticated approaches to problem solving, you discourage people from looking for straightforward answers. She modified the holographic display to show specific examples from the archive data. Look at your major technological innovations over the past millennium. Almost every breakthrough came from minds that were considered unconventional by the standards of their time. But your educational systems have become so refined that they no longer produce unconventional minds. The collective mind of Terminus Station processed this information through their billion-linked consciousnesses, cybernetic logic, struggling with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about intellectual development. Are you claiming that sophisticated analytical methods are counterproductive? I'm claiming that sophisticated analytical methods are tools, Sarah replied. And like any tools, they're good for some jobs and bad for others. If the only tool you have is a quantum computer, every problem looks like it needs quantum-level analysis. But sometimes the best solution is to step back and ask whether you're solving the right problem in the first place. She gestured toward the assembled representatives from galactic educational institutions. The disruptions you're seeing aren't random failures. They're concentrated in areas where sophisticated analytical methods aren't producing results. Students and faculty are questioning established approaches because those approaches aren't working. Director Velnari's Aurora form stabilized into patterns that suggested deep consideration. You believe the crisis is revealing existing flaws rather than creating new problems. I believe the crisis is revealing that your civilization has optimized itself into a corner, Sarah said. You've become so sophisticated that you can't see obvious solutions anymore. The students who are failing your examinations aren't failing because they're stupid. They're failing because they're starting to recognize that some of your examinations are testing the wrong things. She